So today we're going to talk about technology, media, and culture, and the piece of innovation that I chose to review, one that had great social and cultural impact on the world, is the electric guitar. According to Dr. Michael Kasha, string instruments, similar to the guitar, have been around since the formation of some of our oldest civilizations. Bull harps and timbres have been around since the ancient Sumerians and permeated the Babylonian and Egyptian cultures of ancient times. Many of these tortoise-shelled string instruments can be found in museums around the world. As more advanced harps were created, the human beings' love of string instruments pushed their advancement in all new directions. Take this harp from the Roman cemetery in Ur, for example. Dubbed Queen Shebad's harp, this ornately decorated harp has 11 strings and was found in Queen Shebad's tomb. This style of harp, according to Kasha, has its origins from around 2500 to 2000 CE. These stringed instruments are all predecessors of guitars, but in order to move into the great creation of amplified electric guitars, first we need to define exactly what a guitar is and how it is differentiated from these earlier stringed instruments. So, what is a guitar? According to Dr. Kasha, a guitar has a long, fretted neck, flat-wooded soundboard, ribs, and a flat back, most often with incurved sides. We see many similarities between a guitar and a lute, which is where Dr. Kasha says its origins are derived from. The Europeans added frets to older-style timbres and called it a lute, which Kasha defines as short-necked instrument with many strings, a large pear-shaped body with highly vaulted back, and an elaborate, sharply angled peg head. As the guitar became more and more popular, the first incarnation was the four-course guitar, popular throughout the Renaissance. A four-course guitar was a guitar that had a series of 4 unison-tuned paired strings. Around the same time, the 5-course guitar was introduced in Italy, and it eventually replaced the 4-course in popularity. Interesting to note, the standard tuning of this time was A, D, G, B, E, which is the standard tuning of the top strings for modern guitars today. This can be seen on the 5-course guitar by Antonio Stradivarius in 1680. During the 17th century, guitar makers throughout Europe added a 6th set of strings, which became the new standard. Now let's fast forward a few hundred years to early 1900s. Enter the electric guitar. So, what do we know? According to Wheeler in the Guitar Book, a handbook for electric and acoustic guitars, the first electronically amplified guitar was invented by George Beauchamp, who was the general manager of the National Guitar Corporation. He designed this guitar in 1931 and is attributed as being the inventor of the first electric guitar, even though there were many attempts to amplify guitars and banjos in the early 1900s. One of the first electric guitars that was mass-produced and put on the market commercially was the Frying Pan, produced by National Guitar Corporation in 1933. The Frying Pan was a lap steel guitar put together by Beauchamp and his longtime friend and colleague Adolf Rickenbacker. Yes, that Rickenbacker. While the prototype for this guitar was designed with a maple neck and body, it was manufactured with an almost entirely aluminum construct. Bennett tells us that the patent was applied for early, but due to the delay in obtaining the patent, courtesy of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, various other guitar makers were able to put their contributions on the market, which allowed for the evolution of the electric guitar to occur from multiple points with a competitive motivation driving the efforts. The 1930s gave rise to some of the greatest guitar manufacturers such as Rickenbacker, Dobro, Gibson, and Epiphone, who are still powerhouses on the market today. According to Bennett, the aim of these companies over the years and today was to create a competitive electric guitar that did away with all acoustic properties, had a solid body with wound pickups that minimized feedback, and could be heard loudly and clearly on any stage. And I think they have and are continuing to accomplish that mission very successfully. The electric guitar has become an icon of modern music. There could be very little debate over its influence on modern music in most genres, from jazz to rock and roll to country to death metal. In fact, many genres wouldn't even exist without the invention of this incredible instrument. Having a solid body, electronically amplified guitars allow guitar players to have a clean sound that could rival and compete with any microphone in the market, and gave sound engineers and players greater control over their individual sound. There was also a very unique tone generated by an electric guitar that was just not possible to obtain with an acoustic, which gave birth to many genres but was incorporated into already existing styles such as jazz and blues, which gave them a new sound and liveliness that continues to this day. While many great guitar companies exist, the entire line of guitars on the market today would not be there if it weren't for guitar moguls like Gibson, Epiphone, and Fender. Gibson states on their webpage that in 1935, they introduced their distinctive hexagonal pickup on a lap steel guitar labeled the ES-150, better known as the Charlie Christian model. This guitar went on to see great success, and according to the Gibson Guitar Company, it created a great challenge for them to top this monumental achievement. Probably one of the most iconic electric guitars ever produced, however, was introduced by Gibson in 1952, the Les Paul. Gibson went on to continue their market dominance by releasing many other well-recognized and loved guitars such as the Flying V and the SG, just to name a few. Epiphone has been around since 1873, making them one of the oldest American musical instrument producers. Epiphone's webpage lists a great number of artists as their supporters, everyone from jazz greats like George Van Eps up to bluesmen like John Lee Hooker, and a score of mandolin and archtop and steel guitar players used to use Epiphone instruments daily over nationwide broadcasts. Interestingly, Les Paul created his prototype for the Les Paul while working for Epiphone, and a broad range of musicians from the Beatles to Machine Head to Paul Simon and even Nirvana have used Epiphones on their album recordings. In the 1950s, Epiphone fell on hard times, and the company was bought by Gibson, and the brand was revitalized and saved. But we can't talk about the evolution of the electric guitar without talking about Fender. If you look at the history of the company, Fender states that since 1946, they've been a major player on the guitar market. In 1951, Leo Fender introduced the Telecaster, which was the first Spanish-style solid-body electric guitar to be mass-produced. The same year, he introduced what Fender calls a revolutionary invention, the precision bass guitar. These two innovations made Fender a common name, but none of their guitars has more notoriety than the Fender Stratocaster, which appeared in 1954. The Stratocaster is the guitar that most laymen think of when they imagine an electric guitar. So, what impact has the electric guitar had on music? Well, as previously mentioned, we wouldn't have the modern music that we have today if it weren't for the electric guitar. Though a lot can be said for the keyboard and MIDI instruments changing the music industry, I think that musical landscape would be dull indeed if it only consisted of electronic music and acoustic performances. One of the biggest impacts that I can think of is the dawn of classic rock. As rock and roll became more and more mainstream, a select few were redefining rock and adding overdrive and distortion to their guitars to create that classical sound we know and love today. Bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath would never have seen the light of day if they were stuck with acoustic instruments. These classic rock bands paved the way for newer genres of everything from metal to progressive rock, even many of the popular artists today. Another great impact on music is the range and variety of sound that can be produced with an electric guitar. Prior to its invention, acoustic guitars all had a similar sound and feel, with slight variations in tone. After the introduction of the electric guitar, and subsequently a broad range of signal processors and amplification devices, the electric guitar took on a life of its own. We can now use an electric guitar to sound like almost any instrument we can imagine through modern processors, and it gives a guitarist an almost infinite number of possibilities for sound and tone. So much so that almost no two guitarists have the same sound, even if using similar equipment. A third impact on music, and one that is near and dear to my heart, is the playability of an electric guitar. With its slimmer neck, longer fretboard, and easily attainable volume, the electric guitar is much more fun to play than the average acoustic. When electric guitars became cool, everybody wanted to play one. Enjoyment in playing is key to progression when learning an instrument, and the electric guitar made music cool again, and much more suitable for mass consumption. The electric guitar has had a significant cultural impact as well. According to the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, during the time of its introduction to the music scene, many acoustic purists were against the idea of an electric guitar. It wasn't until around the 1950s that everyone realized that the electric guitar was here to stay. In Instruments of Desire, Waxman says that in the days of early rock, the music took a hold of an entire generation, teaching them to buck the system and to pull away from the norms of their parents. Artists like Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly pushed the limits with electric guitars, adding to their already flamboyant stage personas, capturing and riveting music lovers everywhere. The electric guitar eventually took over the music scene and pushed a generation of social change throughout the 60s and 70s. The bands that created the soundtrack for revolution and change were almost exclusively rocking electric guitars. The many movements and protests throughout those decades led to enormous social changes, too many to list in this presentation. Suffice it to say that the electric guitar was pivotal in getting the artists heard by the younger generation. Now, we've seen how far we've come from the origins of the guitar, traveling back thousands of years to the first bowl harps, through the Renaissance, where we look at 4, 5, and 6-course guitars, and up to the invention of the electric guitar and some of the earlier models. But now, let's take a look at where we are today. Over the last century, we've made leaps and bounds in the technological world around us, but ironically enough, the electric guitar has not changed very much since its introduction in the 1930s. The standards that were set by companies like Gibson and Fender are still in place today, and in many cases, these very companies issue re-releases of classic models produced to the original specs. According to the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, the guitar's history mirrors the cultural values, preoccupations, and norms in the United States over time. So too does the guitar's design, especially since the development of solid-body guitar construction by the 50s. They go on to say that by the time the electric guitar was firmly established in the 70s and 80s, artists were just as concerned with the look of the guitar as they were with the sound, and in many cases, their guitars became their identifying signature. The Lemelson Center pretty much sums up the electric guitar in modern times by saying that today, makers of electric guitars often emphasize materials, finishes, and overall designs as much as the technological aspects of their instruments. Style and craftsmanship are and will continue to be especially important to the marketing success of electric guitars. So, it looks like the electric guitar will be with us well into the future. So where would we be without the invention of the electric guitar? That's a good question, and one that I think is impossible to answer. I can't imagine a world without the electric guitar, and it seems almost intuitive that one would be invented sooner or later. Would the social movements of the 60s and 70s have been as effective without the rebellious growl of the Les Paul and Strat? Would music be stuck in an endless cacophony of folk music, classical, early jazz, and swamp blues? Would any of the artists so prominent on the music scene in the last few decades have ever even picked up an instrument? Well, who can say? All I know is that the world would be a very dark and sad place indeed without the invention of the electric guitar.